Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Settle in. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day folded itself up behind you, let it be done for tonight. You don't have to carry it any further. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been hiding all day. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. There is nothing to solve in the next little while, nothing to figure out, nowhere else you need to be. Just the sound of a voice in the dark and a slow old story we're going to walk through together, one gentle step at a time. And if you feel like it, before your eyes get too heavy, you might tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Some of you are in the very early hours, the house quiet around you. Some of you are listening to the rain or to nothing at all. It's a small comfort knowing how many of us are awake in the dark together, all settling down at the same unhurried pace. But there's no need to do anything, just breathe. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the warmth of where you are. Tonight we are going to spend some time with one of the oldest books in the world, a book about conflict, of all things. And I know that might sound like a strange thing to drift off to. Conflict isn't restful, the very word can tighten something in the chest. But stay with me, because here is the gentle surprise hiding at the center of tonight, and it's the thing I most want to give you before you fall asleep. This famous old book about war is not really underneath a book about fighting at all. It is a book about how not to fight, and that is a far softer, far kinder thing than its reputation would ever lead you to believe. The book is called The Art of War. You've almost certainly heard of it, even if you've never read a page. It's one of those titles that floats around the world, quoted on office walls and in films and in the mouths of people trying to sound formidable. In its own language, the original Chinese, it isn't called The Art of War at all. It's called the Bingfa. That word Bingfa simply means military methods. Bing, the soldiers. Fa, the methods, the ways, the rules, military methods. A plain, practical name for what people imagine is a fierce and ruthless book, and it is attributed to a man called Sun Tzu. You might also hear him called Sunzi, which is closer to how it sounds in Chinese, and which simply means master son. Sun, his family name. Zi, an old respectful word, a way of saying master or teacher or honored one. So Sunzi, Master Sun. Some traditions give him a personal name too, Sun Wu. But here is the first thing to soften your expectations, the first place where the legend turns out to be gentler and more uncertain than it sounds. We do not actually know for certain that there ever was a single man named Sun Wu who sat down and wrote this book. He is a figure traditionally placed a very long time ago in a stretch of ancient Chinese history called the Spring and Autumn period. The dates usually given for his life are around the year 544 before the Common Era to around 496 before the Common Era, so 2,500 years ago, give or take. An almost unimaginable distance back in time. He's said to have served a ruler in a place called the State of Wu, one of the many small states that existed in China back then, before it was ever one country. But whether he truly lived as one person the way we picture him is something scholars genuinely debate. The earliest real account we have of his life doesn't come from his own time at all. It comes from a historian named Sima Qian, who wrote a great sweeping work called The Records of the Grand Historian. In Chinese, it's called the Shiji, and Sima Qian was writing roughly 400 years after Sun Tzu was supposed to have lived. 4 centuries. Imagine someone today writing the first detailed biography of a person from the distant past, with that much time and silence in between. So the figure of Sun Tzu comes to us a little blurred, a little legendary, a name attached to a book more than a face we can be sure of. And that's all right. That's how a great deal of ancient wisdom reaches us, through the mist, carried forward by hands we'll never know. Let yourself rest in that for a moment. the strange comfort of how old this all is. People were lying awake at night 2,500 years ago, troubled by their quarrels just as you might be tonight. And someone, or several someones over many years, gathered up what they had learned about conflict and set it down. And it has drifted all the way across the centuries to reach you here in the dark at this hour. Now you might wonder, if we aren't even sure the man existed, how do we know the book itself is genuinely ancient? How do we know it isn't some later invention dressed up to seem old? And this is one of my favorite parts of the whole story. So let me give it to you slowly, because it's the kind of thing that's lovely to picture as you drift. In the year 1972, in a place called Shandong, a province in eastern China, some workers were digging, and they came upon ancient tombs, old burial places that had been sealed up and forgotten for a very, very long time. And inside, among the things laid to rest there, they found bamboo, thin strips of bamboo with writing on them. Because that is how books were made back then, before paper as we know it. Long before, you would take narrow slips of bamboo and write your characters down them in columns, and then bind them together with cord, side by side, so that the whole thing could be rolled up like a little mat. A book you could roll. Picture it, the patience of it. Each character brushed by hand onto a strip of cane. These particular tombs, the ones found in Shandong, are known now as the Yinkashan tombs, named for the place. And they had been sealed, the scholars worked out, somewhere around the years 140 to 118 before the Common Era. So more than 2,000 years ago, the lid was closed on these graves, and they stayed closed until 1972. And among the bamboo slips they found inside was a substantial portion of The Art of War, a real physical copy, or a real piece of one, that had been lying in the dark underground for over 2,000 years. Think about what that means quietly for a moment. It means this book is not a rumor, it is not a thing that might have existed. We have held the proof of its great age in our hands. We can be sure that by the early part of a Chinese dynasty called the Han, this text already existed, in a form we can recognize, already old, already passed along and copied and valued enough to bury with the dead. The bamboo slips are what scholars sometimes call the load-bearing fact, the thing that holds the rest of the story up. Whatever the mist around the man, the book itself is real and genuinely, verifiably ancient. And here is something that always surprises people when they finally learn it. For all its fame, for all the weight of those 2,500 years, the book is tiny. The whole of The Art of War is only about 6,000 characters in the original Chinese. 6,000. That is extraordinarily short. It's the kind of thing you could read in under an hour, comfortably, in a single sitting, a short evening's read, less than a long magazine article, really, in length. It's organized into just 13 chapters, and they're not long chapters. 13 small chapters, 6,000 characters, the kind of thing that would fit in a slim pamphlet you could slip into a coat pocket. And I find there's something almost moving in that. This little book, this pamphlet of a thing, has shaped the way people think about strategy and conflict for 2,500 years. Armies have studied it, rulers have studied it, and in our own time it sits on the reading lists of business schools and military academies, and it turns up in films and television, quoted by characters trying to seem wise or dangerous. All of that influence, all of that weight poured into something you could finish before your tea got cold. The smallest books sometimes cast the longest shadows. The 13 chapters each have their own name, and we'll meet several of them over our time together tonight and in the nights to come, so I'll just let a few of their names drift past you now, like signposts on a road we haven't walked yet. There is a chapter called Laying Plans, which is where the whole book begins. There is one called Attack by Stratagem, one called Tactical Dispositions, one called Weak Points and Strong, one about maneuvering, one called variation in tactics, one called the 9 situations, one called attack by fire. You don't need to remember a single one of these names. They'll come to you again when we need them. I only let them pass now, so the shape of the thing is there, gently in the back of your mind. 13 rooms in a very small, very old house, and we're going to wander through a few of them slowly together now. Here is the heart of it. Here is the thing that this whole evening turns upon, and I want to give it to you carefully because it's the surprise that makes everything else fall into place. When most people think of the art of war, they think of a book about winning, about crushing your rivals, about domination. You'll find it quoted, especially in the world of business, as a kind of manual for ruthlessness. Crush your competitors, dominate the meeting, destroy the other side. There's a whole shelf of books and a whole industry of advice that treats Sun Tzu as a sort of patron saint of aggression, the man who teaches you how to win fights and grind your enemies into the dust. And that reading is almost exactly backwards. That is the thing I most want you to carry into sleep tonight. So let me say it as plainly and gently as I can. The most famous book about war in the history of the world spends most of its pages telling you not to fight. It really does. Once you actually read it, slowly the way we're reading it tonight, you find that the man, or the tradition behind these words, is deeply, almost achingly reluctant to fight. The whole spine of the book bends away from battle, not toward it. And there is one line, more than any other, that holds this up. It comes from that 3rd chapter, the one called Attack by Stratagem. In the Old English translation by a scholar named Lionel Giles, the one most people quote from, it runs like this: "To break the enemy's resistance without fighting is the acme of skill." Let that settle, the acme of skill. The acme means the very peak, the highest point, the summit of the mountain. The greatest possible skill, the book says, the very best a person can do is to break the enemy's resistance without fighting, not to win the fight, to not have the fight at all, and still get where you needed to go. To Sun Tzu, that's the top of the mountain. Everything below that, every actual clash, every blow struck, is already a kind of coming down from the summit. A lesser thing, a falling short. It's sometimes phrased, in the more popular versions you'll see online, as to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill, and we'll come back on another night to the way some of those popular phrasings drift a little from the real words, but the meaning is steady and true. The highest skill is not in the fighting. The highest skill is in arranging things so that the fighting never has to happen. And I want you to feel how strange that is, coming from where it comes from. This is a war book, a book of military methods, and its single most quoted line, its crown jewel, is an argument against the very thing it's supposed to be about. It's as if you opened a famous cookbook and found, on the most treasured page, the chef explaining that the finest meal is the one you didn't need to cook because everyone was already content. There's a quiet humility in it, a wisdom that has clearly seen what fighting actually costs and flinched and decided there had to be a better way. So here is the contrarian little secret of tonight, said plainly. Sun Tzu was not, underneath it all, teaching you how to destroy your opponent. He was teaching you that the person who has to fight has already, in some quiet way, half lost. The general who ends up in a desperate, bloody battle has already failed at the higher art, the art of never needing the battle at all. Strength, in this old book, is not the capacity to win a fight. Strength is the capacity to not need one. And now I want to turn this very gently toward you, toward your own life, your own nights, the real reason any of this matters at this hour. Because you have conflicts, we all do, maybe not battles, not in the way the book first meant, but you have the coworker who needles you, the one whose tone gets under your skin, the meeting where you can feel a disagreement coiling up and you know it's going to come to a head. You have perhaps the recurring argument at home, the one with your partner that you've had so many times you could each play the other's part. The same old groove, worn smooth by repetition, that you fall into the moment a certain subject comes up. Or the difficult relative, the one whose comment at the dinner table can set your whole jaw clenching before you've even decided whether to respond. These are your conflicts. These are the little wars of an ordinary life. And they are exactly what this old book, read in the right and gentle way, turns out to be about. Not because Sun Tzu knew anything about your coworker or your in-laws, but because the deepest things he, or the tradition behind him, understood about conflict are the same whether the stakes are two ancient states grinding against each other or two tired people at a kitchen table at the end of a long week. Think of the argument at work or at home that you keep having, the one that's probably floated up in your mind even now as I describe it. And here is the first soft idea I want to lay beside you tonight, just to rest there. What if the version of that conflict where you finally win, where you finally land the perfect cutting line, where you finally make them admit they were wrong, what if that isn't the highest skill at all? What if, by the standard of this ancient book, the moment you're actually fighting, the moment the argument is really happening, you've already come down off the summit? And what if the true peak, the acme of skill, is the version of that conflict you never have to have because something in how you carried yourself, how you prepared, how you chose your ground, meant it simply never caught fire? That's not weakness. I want to be very clear about that because so much of the noise around this book gets it wrong. Not having the fight is not the same as losing, and it is not the same as being a doormat. In Sun Tzu's world, it is the opposite. It is the highest possible accomplishment. The general who wins without fighting is not the weak one. He's the masterful one, the one who saw so clearly and prepared so well and read the moment so accurately that the clash became unnecessary. To choose not to fight from a position of strength and understanding is the most skillful thing a person can do. And that quietly is a kind of permission. Permission to put down the need to win every exchange. Permission to let some battles simply not happen. Now you might be wondering how a war book ever got such a backwards reputation. How did a text that prizes not fighting above all else become known as a manual for ruthlessness, quoted by every person trying to seem hard and dominant? And the answer is a little sad and a little human. People take the parts they want. They lift the fierce-sounding lines out of the gentle hole and they read it as if it were a guide to conquest, because conquest is exciting and restraint is quiet. The world is full of versions of this book that have, in a sense, completely inverted it. That have taken a treatise on how to avoid the catastrophe of war and turned it into a pep talk for going to war in the conference room, crush them, dominate, win at all costs. And every one of those readings has walked straight past the summit of the mountain, that single line about the acme of skill, and headed down into the valley where the fighting is, mistaking the valley for the point. We're not going to do that, you and I. Tonight, and in the nights ahead, we're going to read it the slow way, the true way, the way that finds, underneath all that fierce reputation, a surprisingly tender intelligence. A book that has clearly seen how much fighting costs in lives and in ruin, and that keeps trying, chapter after chapter, to steer you away from it. And it begins this argument right at the start. The very first chapter, the one called Laying Plans, opens not with a battle cry, not with talk of glory or conquest, but with a kind of solemn warning. It calls war a matter of vital importance to the state. It says that war is a road, and that the road leads either to safety or to ruin. And so the chapter says, It is a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected, meaning do not rush into this. Do not take this lightly. Think and think hard before you ever set a foot on this road, because it leads either to safety or to ruin, and there is no taking it back. Do you see what the very first move of this war book is? It isn't aggression, it's deliberation. It's sitting down and thinking carefully before you act. The book's opening note is a kind of caution, a hand laid on your arm, slowing you down. Before you fight, before you even consider fighting, stop and weigh it. Is this road truly worth walking because it leads either to safety or to ruin? And isn't that already something you can carry to your own table, your own office? Before you let the argument start, before you take that first step onto the road of the quarrel, to stop and think just for a breath. Is this one worth it? Where does this road actually lead? To safety or to ruin? Most of the small wars of an ordinary life, if we paused at the very start and asked that one question, we'd find we didn't need to walk at all. The road led only to ruin, to a long cold evening, to a wound that would take days to heal, and to nothing gained. And the chapter that begins this whole famous war book is gently telling you to pause at that very edge and ask. So that is where we are as you settle deeper into the dark. We have an old, small book, about 6,000 characters, 13 short chapters, readable in under an hour. We have its proof of age, those bamboo slips lying in the Shandong earth for 2,000 years, sealed away around the years 140 to 118 before the Common Era, found again only in 1972. We have its half-legendary author, Master Sun Tzu, Sun Wu, placed 2,500 years ago in the spring and autumn period, in the state of Wu, a man whose very existence comes to us through the mist, through the historian Sima Qian, writing 4 centuries later in his great records of the grand historian, the Shiji. And we have the surprise that turns the whole thing around. That this most famous of war books has, at its very summit, the idea that the highest skill is to win without fighting at all. That the man who must fight has already half lost. That strength is the capacity not to engage. Rest in that for a while. You don't need to hold any of it tightly. The dates will slip away from you, and that's fine. The names can blur back into the mist they came from, and that's fine too. If only one thing stays with you as you drift, let it be this small and steady idea. That the wisest book about conflict ever written spends most of its breath telling you not to fight. That there is no weakness in the argument you choose not to have. That the peak of skill, the very top of the mountain, is the quarrel that never needed to begin. And we are only at the start of the road. There is so much more waiting for us in this little book, and we'll come to it slowly in its own time. There's a chapter that lays out, in order, the very best to the very worst ways of meeting an opponent. Like rungs on a ladder, we can climb down whenever a conflict rises up at work. There's a famous line about knowing your enemy and knowing yourself that almost everyone quotes, but almost no one quotes the whole of, because the most important third of it gets left out. There's the idea that a victorious army wins first and fights afterward, while a defeated army fights first and only then goes looking for victory. There's a passage tucked near the end of the book that I think is the most quietly wise thing in all of it, a 2,500-year-old warning never to fight out of anger, that the anger will pass, but the ruin it causes may not. And there are even a few famous sayings that everyone believes came from Sun Tzu that he never wrote at all, which will gently set right. But all of that is for the deeper part of the night. For now, there is nothing to do, and nowhere to go, and no battle anywhere that needs you tonight. The arguments waiting in your life will keep until morning, and we'll have softer ways to meet them by the time we're through. For now, just let the oldest wisdom about conflict do the gentlest thing it knows how to do, which is to tell you, across 2,500 years, that the wisest move is so often simply to rest, and to choose your battles slowly, and to know that the strongest thing you can do tonight is nothing at all. So let your breath go slow, let the dates and the names drift down into the dark like leaves onto still water. And stay with me, because the road through this little book has only just begun, and it leads gently somewhere very peaceful. Let me tell you where this little book actually comes from, because it matters, and because the knowing of it is itself a kind of comfort. For a long time, people argued about whether it was real, whether there had ever been a single man named Sun Wu who set it all down, or whether it was a collection stitched together over many years and given one quiet name. The earliest story we have of him comes from a historian called Sima Qian, who wrote his great records of the grand historian some 4 centuries after Sun Tzu was supposed to have lived, and 4 centuries is a long time, long enough for a man to soften into a legend. So we hold his life lightly. We say, the tradition tells us rather than we know for certain. He belongs to a time the Chinese call the Spring and Autumn period, and he is said to have served the state of Wu somewhere around 2,500 years ago. That is all far away, and far away things are good to fall asleep to. But here is the part that is not soft at all, the part that is solid as a stone you could hold in your hand. In 1972, in Shandong Province, near a place called Yinkashan, workers came upon old tombs that had been sealed away for more than 2,000 years. The earth had kept them quiet since somewhere between 140 and 118 years before the Common Era. And inside, among the things laid to rest there, were strips of bamboo, written on long ago, carrying the words of this very book. Not a copy made yesterday, not a rumor passed mouth to mouth. The actual text, recognizable, ancient, pulled up out of the ground after lying in the dark for longer than most empires last. So whatever we choose to believe about the man, the book is real, and it is genuinely, almost impossibly old. Picture those slender strips of bamboo bound together, sleeping in the earth through the rise and fall of dynasties, waiting. There is something restful in that. Some things keep, no matter how dark the place they wait in. And here is the thing that surprises almost everyone. For all its fame, this is a small book. The whole of it runs to only about 6,000 Chinese characters. 6,000. The entire work that has shaped how people think about conflict for 2,500 years is short enough that you could read the whole thing in under an hour, sitting in a quiet room before your tea goes cold. It is not a heavy tome. It is closer to a pamphlet, 13 short chapters, each one a small door into a different idea. Laying plans, waging war, attack by stratagem, tactical dispositions. On and on, 13 of them, each one brief, each one able to be turned over in the mind like a smooth pebble. There is a kindness in smallness. The largest things sometimes come wrapped in the smallest packages, and a book you could finish on a lunch break has outlived everyone who ever doubted it. Now here is where I want to gently turn the whole thing on its head, because the way most people carry this book in their minds is upside down. You have probably heard the art of war spoken of as a manual for crushing your rivals, for dominating the room, for treating everyone across the table from you as an enemy, to be beaten and broken. It gets quoted in boardrooms and put on lists of books that ambitious people are meant to read so they can win, win, win. And almost all of that misses the heart of it entirely. It is not the book Sun Tzu wrote, it is the inversion of it, the photograph held to a mirror, because the line that sits closest to the center of everything, the one from the 3rd chapter, the chapter called Attack by Stratagem, is this. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. the highest art, the peak of mastery. Not to win the fight, but to make the fight unnecessary in the first place. Lionel Giles, who gave us the first careful English translation of the whole book back in 1910, rendered it as breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Sit with that for a moment here in the dark. The most famous war book in all of history says that the truest skill is not in the battle at all, but in never having to enter it. And once you have heard that, you start to see it everywhere in the 13 chapters. The man was not teaching you how to destroy the people who stand against you. He was teaching you that the person who has to fight has already half lost. The general who is the very best does not win 100 battles. The general who is the very best wins without a single one. That is the whole quiet revolution hidden inside a book everyone thinks is about aggression. Think for a moment of your own life of the small wars that flare up when you are tired, the disagreement that keeps returning at work, the one with the same person in the same room over the same tired ground, the argument at home that you both know the shape of by heart, the one that begins almost before either of you has decided to begin it. We treat these like battles to be won. We rehearse them. We gather our reasons like soldiers. And Sun Tzu, across 2,500 years, leans in very softly and says, what if the skill was never in the winning? What if it was in the not fighting at all? Let us stay with chapter 3 a little longer, because it carries something most people miss completely when they quote it. The line everyone knows is the one about subduing the enemy without fighting, but chapter 3 does not stop there. It continues, and what it says next is worth holding quietly in mind. Sun Tzu lists 4 forms of attack, 4 ways of handling an opponent, and he ranks them from the highest form of generalship all the way down to the worst policy of all. The ranking is not what most people expect. The highest form, the very best move you can make against an opposing force, is to balk the enemy's plans, to interrupt what they are trying to do before it takes shape, not to meet their charge head-on, but to understand where they are going and gently, quietly, make that path unavailable. The second best is to prevent the junction of their forces, to keep their strength from combining, from becoming more than it is. The third, less good but sometimes necessary, is to attack the army in the field, to meet the opposition directly out in the open. And the fourth, the worst policy of all, the move that any skilled commander avoids if there is any other option remaining, is to besiege walled cities. Besieging a walled city, in Sun Tzu's world, was catastrophically expensive. It meant months of preparation, enormous expenditure of equipment and lives, and even then no guarantee of success. The walls did not fall quickly. People died, resources drained away, and even if the city eventually fell, the cost to the attacker was often as ruinous as the cost to the defender. The worst outcome of a siege was not necessarily that you lost. Sometimes the worst outcome was that you won, but at a price that left you weaker than before. Take a slow breath here. Let that image rest with you for a moment. The walled city that costs everything to take. Now bring that ladder into your own life, into the specific disagreement you have been carrying, not an abstract conflict, but a real one. The project at work where your colleague keeps quietly undermining the plan, the boundary with a family member that you have tried to hold and watched get crossed again, the conversation with your partner that the two of you keep almost having, then retreating from, then almost having again. The walled city move is the one most of us default to when we are tired and frustrated. It is the direct, frontal confrontation. The raised voice, the list of grievances delivered all at once, the dramatic escalation that seems like the only remaining option because every quieter approach appears to have failed. It feels necessary by the time it arrives. It feels like the only honest thing left to do. And sometimes, in extreme circumstances, it is genuinely necessary. Sun Tzu never says never fight. He says fight as a last resort, and know the cost before you begin. But notice what sits above it on his hierarchy, bulking the plans. This is something far more available than we imagine. With the colleague who keeps undermining the project, the bulk the plans move is not to confront them about their behavior in a meeting where everyone is watching. It is to understand what they are actually trying to achieve and to address that quietly, one conversation at a time, before the behavior has a chance to crystallize into something harder to move. It is to ask a real question about their concern before it becomes a grievance. It is to make the undermining less useful to them by removing the conditions that make it feel necessary, or at least satisfying, in the first place. Preventing the junction of forces might look, in a work setting, like addressing one person's worry separately before it combines with another person's doubt and becomes a coalition of resistance that is far harder to turn. Small conversations before the big one. Individual moments of honesty before the group meeting becomes a theater of conflict. Not manipulation, not strategy in the cynical sense, but the genuine, quiet work of attending to a situation before it compounds. And then attacking the army in the field when it is truly needed, direct and honest conversation, not dressed up in euphemism, not buried in passive signals, but clear and calm and face-to-face. This is not the worst option, this is the third option. Sometimes it is where you land, and when you do, landing there cleanly is far better than the siege. The siege is the last resort, the point of no return. The conversation that has escalated past the possibility of repair in the moment, that has broken something between two people or between a person and a team that will take months to recover from, even if it ends in nominal victory. Most of us have been in a siege. We know what they feel like. The exhaustion that follows is not the exhaustion of battle. It is the exhaustion of having burned a great deal to take something that perhaps could have been reached a different way. Sun Tzu is not telling you to avoid all conflict forever. He is telling you to look at the ladder before you choose your position on it, and to start as high as you possibly can, because every rung you descend costs more than the one above it, and the cost is not paid by an abstraction. The cost is paid by you, by your sleep, by the relationship, by the working environment you have to return to on Monday morning. Winning without fighting, then, is not passivity. It is not swallowing your real position or pretending the disagreement does not exist. It is choosing the form of your engagement with the greatest care. The argument you never have to have, the confrontation that dissolves before it solidifies because you attended to it early enough, that is not weakness. In Sun Tzu's framework, that is the highest skill available to a person, the acme of it. Let your breath go slow for a moment. Let the image of that ladder rest in you. The bulk, the prevent, the field, the siege. You do not need to memorize it. You only need to notice the next time something begins to build, where on that ladder your instinct is pulling you, and whether there is a higher rung still available. There is a second passage in chapter 3 that most people only know in pieces. It is the one everyone quotes. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. That is the version that travels. That is the version on the motivational posters, on the corporate slide decks, on the desk calendars. And it is real. It is genuinely in the text. But it is only 1/3 of what Sun Tzu actually said. The full passage continues in 2 more steps, and the steps are the interesting part. The first condition, the one everyone quotes, is knowing both the enemy and yourself. 100 battles, no fear. Good. Fine. Straightforward enough, at least on the surface. But then he continues, if you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. You win some and you lose some in an essentially unpredictable pattern because you are operating on incomplete information. And then the third condition, the one nobody frames in a poster, is the quiet devastation at the end. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Sit with those three conditions together for a moment, because they reveal something the abbreviated version hides completely. The first condition is symmetric. Know both things, enemy and self. It takes two kinds of knowledge to reach safety. The second condition breaks the symmetry in a surprising direction, because the easy assumption would be that knowing yourself is the lesser half. You already live inside yourself. You know your own position, your own reasons, your own history. What you need is more information about the other person, the one who is frustrating you, the colleague who seems irrational, the partner who keeps doing the thing that hurts you in exactly the same way. Surely the gap is out there on the other side. But Sun Tzu does not say that. He says, knowing yourself without knowing the enemy gives you roughly even odds, which means he places knowing yourself at exactly half the equation. Not a smaller half, not the easier half, exactly half. And the third condition, knowing neither yourself nor the enemy, tells us the direction of the worst catastrophe. It is not knowing the enemy that fails you most, it is the combination. But notice where the combination begins to break down, which piece falls away first in most real conflicts. Think of the last time you were in a difficult conversation that went badly, not the other person's behavior, but your own. Did you know going into it what you actually wanted out of it, not the position you had rehearsed, not the grievance you had prepared to deliver, but what you genuinely needed from the exchange? Did you know what would make you feel heard versus what would make you feel vindicated? Did you know the difference between those two things in that moment? Did you know when you were getting defensive and why? And whether the defensiveness was protecting something real or something that no longer needed protecting? Did you know what you were afraid of underneath the disagreement? Most of us, most of the time, begin hard conversations with a far clearer picture of the other person's failings than of our own architecture. We know what they keep doing wrong. We have a very clear catalogue of that. But we have been less thorough, far less thorough, in examining our own position, our own history, with this particular shape of conflict, our own patterns, the ways we tend to escalate or retreat or deflect, without quite deciding to. Sun Tzu is saying that this is exactly half the problem, and it is usually the half that is most available for change. You cannot always know the other person's interior. You can guess, you can observe, you can ask, and we will come to the ways of doing that well, but you have complete access to yourself. And most of us use that access very little, especially in the moments when the argument is already forming, when the familiar frustration is rising, and the temptation is to reach for the argument we already know, rather than to pause and ask what is actually happening inside us right now. This is not a therapy session, and it does not need to be. Sun Tzu was not especially interested in emotional self-reflection as a personal practice. He was interested in winning. He was interested in what actually works. And what he noticed 2,500 years ago is that the general who does not know his own position, his own supply lines, his own fatigue levels, his own capacity at this precise moment, that general will lose, not because the enemy is especially strong, but because half the battlefield is inside him and he has not looked at it. Knowing yourself, in the everyday conflict sense, is something specific. It is knowing your own triggers, the particular shapes of situation that reliably cause you to say things you will regret. It is knowing how tired you need to be before a minor irritation becomes a confrontation. It is knowing the difference between a genuine boundary and an old wound that has been touched. It is knowing what a win actually looks like for you in this specific disagreement, as opposed to what a win looked like the last time someone made you feel this way, because those two things are often not the same situation, even when they feel identical. And it is knowing the difference between what you say you want, which is usually something reasonable sounding like a fair outcome, or to be understood, or for the other person to acknowledge the problem and what you actually want, which might be something more complicated, like to feel powerful again after feeling small, or to be proven right in front of someone who witnessed you being wronged, or simply to not be the person who has to manage everything anymore. None of those real wants are shameful. They are human, but they are different from the stated position. And a conversation that is secretly about one of them, but openly about something else, tends to go in circles. The circle is the clue. If you find yourself having the same argument repeatedly, it is often because the argument that keeps appearing is not quite the real argument, and the resolution that would actually settle it has not yet been named. Sun Tzu is not interested in whether you feel better about yourself. He is interested in whether your operation succeeds, and he is telling you that clarity about your own position is as essential as clarity about your opponent's. Not as a virtue, as a tactical requirement. Let the breath come slow. You do not need to solve your recurring argument tonight. You only need to let the question sit with you a little. What am I actually trying to win here? Not as a judgment on yourself, just as a genuine question held quietly in the dark. There is a third thing in Chapter 4 that follows naturally from all of this, and it is one of the most quietly counterintuitive ideas in the whole text. A victorious army wins its victories before seeking battle. A defeated army fights first and afterwards looks for victory. Read that again, slowly. The winning happens before the fighting, not during it, not after it, before. This is the inversion that changes everything about how you understand conflict. We have a very powerful cultural assumption that conflict is where you determine the outcome. The fight is the event, and you go into it hoping to come out ahead. The preparation matters, yes, but the result is decided in the arena in real time by whoever brings the greater skill and will in the moment of confrontation. Sun Tzu says, this is how losing armies think. The winning army has already done something before the first engagement. It has secured itself against defeat. It has looked at the ground, assessed the resources, shored up its own weaknesses, and arranged its position so that it cannot be destroyed. Only then does it look for the opportunity to move. The opportunity is found outside in the opponent's errors and exposures, but the security is built inside through your own choices and preparation before anything begins. In Chapter 4, he puts it plainly. The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy. To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. Two movements. First, secure yourself. Second, wait. Not waiting as passivity, but waiting as readiness. The patient position of someone who has done the work and can afford to move slowly because they are not desperate. Now bring this close to your own life, to something real. You have a salary conversation coming. You have known for months that it is overdue, that the gap between what you contribute and what you receive has been quietly widening, that the right moment to address it keeps almost arriving and then passing. And there is a version of you that will walk into that conversation reactive, slightly anxious, hoping it goes well, half prepared, responding to whatever direction the other person steers it. That version is the defeated army. It is fighting first and hoping for victory afterward. The other version of you has done something different before that conversation begins. Not something complicated. You have found out, specifically and in numbers, what the comparable roles in comparable organizations pay. You have assembled a clear account, concrete and specific, of what you have contributed since the last time this was discussed. You have thought through what number you actually need, what number you want, and what you will do if the conversation goes in a direction you did not expect. You have thought about where the other person is positioned, what constraints they are likely to cite, what they are probably thinking about this discussion before it begins. You have thought about where you genuinely agree with them and where you do not. You have thought about your own nervousness and decided that it does not change your position. You have arrived at the conversation, in Sun Tzu's terms, already secure against defeat, because the worst reasonable outcome is something you have already faced in your own thinking, and you are not destroyed by it. That preparation does not guarantee the result you want. Sun Tzu is not promising you a formula for always getting exactly what you want. He is pointing out that the person who has done this work is operating from a completely different ground than the person who has not, and that the difference is not about cleverness or aggression or confidence in the theatrical sense. It is about preparation, about having won the internal argument, resolved your own position, secured your own ground before the external conversation begins. The same principle applies to the harder conversation, the one with the family member who keeps crossing a line you have not quite been able to hold. You have probably had a version of that conversation before, more than once, and if it has not gone the way you hoped, it is worth asking what you went into it with. Did you know specifically what you were asking for in terms clear enough that you could tell afterward whether it had been agreed to? Did you know what you would do if it happened again? Not as a threat, but as a genuine answer to yourself, held privately. Had you secured your own position against the worst outcome so that you were not negotiating from fear of the conversation going badly, but from the steadiness of someone who has already faced that possibility? The prepared position is not a guarantee of comfort. Sometimes the conversation is hard no matter how ready you are. But there is a difference between a hard conversation entered from prepared ground and the same conversation entered in a panic, reactive, desperate to reach a conclusion quickly because the uncertainty is unbearable. One of those has a fighting chance. The other is the defeated army, hoping. There is also something else in Sun Tzu's framing that is worth naming here, something quiet and easy to miss. He says that to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands. Not partly in our hands, not mostly. Our hands. The security of your own position is always within reach, even in situations where the outcome is not. You cannot always control whether the salary conversation goes well. You cannot always control whether the family member hears what you are saying. You cannot always control whether the team respects the boundary you have tried to hold, but you can always do the work of securing your own ground before any of that begins. That part is yours, and Sun Tzu is saying that this is the more important part because it is the foundation under everything else. He also says something else in that same passage, 4 short words that carry a great deal of weight. He wins his battles by making no mistakes, not by making brilliant moves, not by outmaneuvering a genius opponent with a stroke of inspired improvisation, by making no mistakes, by being so thoroughly prepared that there is nothing obvious for the situation to exploit in him, by removing one by one the vulnerabilities that would give an opponent an opening. This sounds less exciting than the image of the brilliant tactician who strikes at exactly the right moment with exactly the right move, but it is considerably more reliable, and in everyday conflict where the opponent is usually not a military force, but a person you have to continue living or working with, the removal of your own vulnerabilities is a kinder form of strategy than the hunt for theirs. Knowing your own triggers means they are less available as leverage. Knowing your own real position means you are less likely to say something in the heat of the moment that you will have to manage the consequences of for weeks afterward. Knowing what you actually want means you are less likely to win the argument and lose the relationship, which is a very common form of the destroyed kingdom. We are going to return to that image, the destroyed kingdom, because Sun Tzu has something extremely specific to say about it in a different chapter, something that cuts right to the heart of why so many of our most familiar conflicts keep producing outcomes nobody wanted. But first, let us rest here for a moment. Let the breath come easy. The room is still around you. The ideas are settling, not needing to be solved or acted on tonight. They are just here, like old company in the dark. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice where your body has been holding its weight. Let the shoulders drop a little if they have risen. You do not need to have the conversation tonight. You do not need to be prepared for anything right now except sleep. We will continue together, gently. You might notice, if you have been listening closely, that everything we have covered so far in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 has been about something interior, about your own thinking, your own preparation, your own knowledge of your position before the engagement begins. And that might seem strange for a book that is supposed to be about strategy toward other people. But this is exactly the point Sun Tzu is making, that the business advice version of this book tends to flatten out of existence. The received version, the one sold in airport bookshops and quoted in management consultancies, tends to treat the art of war as a guide to reading and exploiting other people. Know their weakness and strike it. Move quickly when they are slow. Hit where they are unprepared. It presents the book as a manual of external technique aimed outward at the people across from you. But the actual text, the one that has been read continuously for over 2,000 years, begins inside. The 5 constant factors, the very first analytical framework Sun Tzu establishes in Chapter 1, begin with the moral law, the alignment between you and the purpose you are serving. They include heaven, the timing. They include earth, the terrain. They include the commander, whose qualities are wisdom and sincerity and benevolence, not ruthlessness. And method, the discipline of your own conduct. 4 of the 5 factors are primarily about you, your alignment, your reading of the environment, your own qualities as a person doing the thinking. The external opponent is present in all of it, of course. You need to understand where they are positioned. But the first question is always about your own ground. That is where Sun Tzu starts every time, and it is the part that gets quietly dropped in most popular retellings because it is less exciting than the clever move, less quotable than the striking observation about how to defeat a superior force. The striking observation is there too. We will get to it. But the interiority, the self-knowledge, the preparation from the inside out, is the foundation under the striking observation. Without it, the technique is a house built on sand, impressive in calm weather and unreliable in the actual storm. Slow breath. Let the darkness be soft. We are not in a hurry here. There is one more thing in Chapter 4 that is worth bringing gently into the light before we move on, because it completes the picture of what Sun Tzu means by the prepared position. He says, very simply, one may know how to conquer without being able to do it. This is a sentence that rewards sitting with. One may know how to conquer without being able to do it. Knowing the right move is not the same as having the conditions to make it. Understanding exactly what needs to happen does not mean the ground is currently ready for it to happen, and this, rather than being a defeat, is the natural state of the prepared general. You know the winning move. You are not yet in a position to execute it. So, you wait, not forever, not passively, but with the patience of someone who has done the work and understands that the opportunity is not yet available, and that forcing it before it is will cost more than it gains. In everyday conflict, this looks like knowing exactly what the right conversation is, knowing what you need to say and how you would say it, and recognizing that this particular Tuesday evening, with both of you tired from a long week, with the children not yet asleep down the hall, with the small irritations of the day still close to the surface, this is not the moment, not because you are avoiding the conversation, not because you are choosing to let the problem fester, but because you know the terrain, and the terrain right now does not favor the outcome you actually want. And so you wait. You hold your position. You remain ready. And when the moment is genuinely available, when both of you have slept, when the irritants of the immediate week have settled, when there is actual space in the room for the real conversation, rather than a fight shaped like the real conversation, then you speak. This is not weakness. This is not conflict avoidance in the therapeutic sense. This is what Sun Tzu means by the prepared patient position. You know how to conquer. You are waiting for the ground that will let you do it. And the waiting is active, watchful, ready to move the moment the conditions align. The defeated army does not wait. It fights in every terrain, regardless of conditions, because the urgency feels unbearable and the waiting feels like losing. And that is exactly how it ends up fighting in the worst possible terrain, at the worst possible time, and wondering afterward why the outcome was so costly for something that should have been simple. Let the breath go slow and long. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, and all of it has been building towards something. The hierarchy of attack. The fullness of knowing yourself as much as knowing the other. The victory that is won before the first word. The patience that is not passivity, but readiness. And these are not separate ideas, they are one idea, seen from different angles. The supreme move is not to fight. The path to not fighting is to have already won inside before anything begins. The path to that is knowing your own position with the same care you bring to understanding the other person. And the patience to hold that prepared ground until the terrain is ready is not a concession to weakness. It is the mark of the general who wins. There is a line Sun Tzu does not actually say, one of the most widely circulated quotations attached to his name on the internet and in casual conversation, that goes something like, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." You will see it everywhere, on walls, on coffee mugs, in the opening slides of presentations about negotiation strategy, and it is close enough to what he does say that the attribution has stuck. But it is a paraphrase, a smoothed and slightly shifted version of the actual Giles rendering, which is that to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. The meaning is near enough, but the paraphrase has a confidence, an aphoristic certainty that slightly misses the texture of what the original says, because acme of skill is different from supreme art. Acme of skill names an achievement. It says this is what the most skilled practitioner achieves. Supreme art suggests it is the first principle, the foundation of everything, and Sun Tzu's actual architecture is more interesting than either phrase suggests. The highest skill is not the absence of fighting as an absolute rule. It is the capacity to make fighting unnecessary through everything that happens before the encounter begins. The planning, the understanding of yourself and the other, the securing of your position, the patience to wait for the right ground, the acme of skill is the outcome of all of that, not the starting point. We will come back to the fake quotes before this night is done, because there are a couple of them that have been so thoroughly attached to Sun Tzu's name that most people would be surprised to learn they come from somewhere else entirely or from nowhere at all. That part of the story is worth knowing, but for now, let it simply rest at the edge of your awareness, one more small loop left quietly open in the dark. For now, just this. You have been listening to ideas that are older than most of the institutions that shape your daily life, older than the organizations you work inside, older than the countries most of us were born in, older than the legal frameworks that govern how we treat one another. And they have survived not because they are good philosophy in the abstract, but because they work. Because the person who enters a difficult conversation knowing their own position, having secured their ground, having chosen the highest rung on the ladder rather than defaulting to the siege, that person does better than the one who does not. Not always, not perfectly, but reliably, measurably over time. That is why a 6,000 character pamphlet, small enough to finish in an afternoon, has been read continuously for over 2,000 years. It is not because it is beautiful Though there are passages that are quietly beautiful, it is because it is correct. And the people who tested it across century after century of the hardest possible conditions kept finding that it was correct. Take a slow, easy breath. You do not need to carry any of this as weight. Let it float beside you quietly as the dark gets softer. We are going to continue in a moment with something that might be the most surprising passage in the whole book. A passage from one of the final chapters, one that most people never reach, that says something about anger and time and kingdoms destroyed that cuts closer to the heart of everyday conflict than anything we have yet encountered tonight. There is a chapter near the end of the book that almost nobody discusses. When people talk about the art of war, they talk about knowing your enemy, they talk about subduing without fighting, they talk about water and terrain and the prepared position. But chapter 12, the chapter on attack by fire, ends with something that reads less like military instruction and more like a quiet warning from an old man who has seen too many ruin. Sun Tzu writes, in the Giles translation, that no ruler should put troops into the field merely to gratify his own spleen. No general should fight a battle simply out of pique. If it is to your advantage, make a forward move. If not, stay where you are. And then he writes this: anger may, in time, change to gladness. Vexation may be succeeded by content. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never again come into being. Read that last line again, slowly. A kingdom that has once been destroyed can never again come into being. He's not talking about a metaphor. He's talking about actual kingdoms, actual cities, actual people who will not return. But the reason this passage hits so differently when you read it today, in whatever room you are lying in tonight, is that it maps almost perfectly onto the things we actually destroy in the heat of an argument. Not kingdoms, friendships, marriages. A working relationship with a colleague you have to see every Monday morning for the next 4 years. A quieter version of your relationship with a parent or a sibling that existed before one particular dinner went badly. Those things, once destroyed, do not always come back either. Sun Tzu was not a therapist. He was not writing a book about emotional intelligence or interpersonal wellness. He was writing a manual for generals who commanded armies in a period of genuine, brutal warfare, when the stakes of losing were not discomfort or an awkward silence, but the deaths of thousands of people and the erasure of the states they served. And yet here, in the closing movement of his chapter on fire attacks, he pauses and says, "Do not fight out of anger, not because anger is morally bad, not because your anger is wrong, but because anger is temporary and destruction is permanent. Anger may change to gladness. He grants you that. He is not saying your anger is unjustified. He is saying that anger moves, that it is a weather system passing through you, that what you feel with such absolute certainty at 9 in the evening after a long and frustrating day will feel different at 9 the next morning. And vexation may be succeeded by content. He grants you that too. The irritation lifts, the grievance softens. This is not wishful thinking, it is a description of how human beings actually work, and he knew it because he had watched soldiers in the grip of fury make decisions they could not unmake. But a kingdom once destroyed does not return. The email you sent at 11 at night when you were at the end of your patience. The thing you said in the argument that you have never quite been able to unsay. The way you handled that meeting in front of everyone when you were so certain you were right that you were willing to humiliate someone to prove it. These are the kingdoms. Small kingdoms, maybe, measured against the wars he was writing about. But yours. This is the passage that most of the business books built on Sun Tzu's reputation simply do not use. They prefer the aggressive lines, the imposing your will lines, the lines that make you feel like a strategist in the middle of a battle. And those lines are real, and we will come to some of them. But this passage is the one that tells you why the whole framework exists. The entire apparatus of preparation and patience and terrain reading and waiting for the opening, all of it exists because the thing you destroy in a moment of anger is real, and it cannot always be rebuilt. Let that settle somewhere quiet. You do not need to think about it analytically. Just let it be there. Now move back a little further in the text to chapter 2, which is called Waging War, and which arrives very early, only the second chapter, right after the opening chapter on laying plans. And in this chapter, Sun Tzu makes a claim that would have seemed almost perversely obvious to any general who had actually fought a long campaign, but that gets lost in our ordinary picture of what military strategy looks like. He writes, there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare, not one. He does not say prolonged warfare is generally counterproductive. He does not say it tends to end badly. He says there is no instance of benefit. As a categorical statement, this is remarkable because it is coming from a man who is writing a book on how to conduct war. He is not a pacifist making a moral argument against conflict. He is a strategist making a practical argument. Prolonged war drains you. It drains your treasury, your food supply, your soldiers' energy, your civilian population's tolerance, your commander's judgment. The longer a conflict runs, the more it costs, and at some point the cost exceeds anything you could possibly win by continuing. He was writing about armies and grain supplies, but think about what prolonged warfare looks like at the scale of an ordinary life. There is a particular kind of conflict that many people carry for years, not the dramatic kind, not the one that explodes and ends and leaves a clear before and after, the slow kind, the one that never fully resolves, the grievance that reopens in a slightly different shape every few months, reliably, at family gatherings or in certain conversations or whenever a particular name comes up. The disagreement at work that was never quite settled, so both parties have simply learned to rout around each other, which costs both of them something every single day. The version of an argument with a partner that you have each perfected over years, in which you both know your lines, you both know how the other will respond, you both know how it ends, and yet somehow it keeps beginning again. This is prolonged warfare. And Sun Tzu's observation holds. No instance of benefit. Not because you are a bad person for being in it, but because prolonged conflict is a cost structure, and it runs continuously, and the resources it drains, emotional energy, trust, goodwill, the mental space that might otherwise go towards something you actually want, do not replenish themselves as fast as the conflict spends them. De-escalation in this context is not surrender, it is cost control. It is the decision of a general who has looked honestly at the campaign and calculated what continuing will cost versus what can actually be won, and who has decided that preserving resources and position is more valuable than pressing a costly attack on ground that was never going to yield enough to justify the price. Sun Tzu would not call this weakness, he would call it calculation, he would call it the higher generalship. Because the general who keeps fighting a war that drains his own country is not demonstrating strength, he is demonstrating poor arithmetic. This is hard to sit with sometimes because we carry a very deep cultural conviction that not fighting back is the same as losing, that if someone wrongs you and you do not press the point, you have conceded something real. And sometimes that is true. There are conflicts worth the cost. There are things worth defending past the point of comfort. The prepared position and the patient waiting we talked about earlier, those are not about refusing all conflict. They are about ensuring that when you do engage, the terrain and the timing are in your favor, and the objective is genuinely worth what the engagement will cost. But the prolonged war that nobody is winning, that is just running because it has been running. That is the one Sun Tzu is warning you about. Not with moral urgency, with arithmetic. Take a slow breath, let the counting pause for a moment. Whatever you are carrying tonight, you do not need to resolve it right now. You are just listening to an old voice from a very long time ago, saying something quietly, true in the dark. Now we come to the chapter that contains what may be the most memorable image in the entire text. Chapter 6 is called Weak Points and Strong, and it opens with a series of elegant reversals about initiative and position, and then, at a particular turn in the argument, Sun Tzu writes this: "Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing." And then, a little later, "Military tactics are like unto water, for water in its natural course runs away from high places and hastens downwards. So in war, avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak. Be like water." You have probably heard this phrase. It has traveled so far from its origin that most people who say it are not sure where it comes from anymore. It sounds like a martial arts proverb, or something attributed to Bruce Lee, which it also was, in a different context. But the idea in its original form in this chapter is doing something specific and precise. It is not asking you to be formless in the sense of having no character or no convictions. It is describing how water moves by finding the actual shape of what is in front of it, not the shape it wishes were there, or the shape that worked on different terrain last time. Water does not arrive at a hillside and attempt to flow upward because that is the direction it was already going. It reads the hill, it bends around it, or it finds the path of least resistance through it, or it collects until there is enough weight and depth to move the obstacle. It is not passive. Water moving downhill is one of the most powerful forces in the natural world. Given enough time, it carves canyons. But it does none of this by insisting the terrain be different from what it is. This is what Sun Tzu means when he says military tactics are like water. The good general does not arrive at a battle with a fixed plan and execute it regardless of what he finds. He reads what is actually in front of him, the specific ground, the specific enemy, the specific conditions of this particular engagement, and he moves accordingly. The tactics are shaped by the reality, not imposed upon it. And this is the principle mapped onto an argument at work or at home that changes almost everything about how you walk into a difficult conversation. Most of us, when we are anticipating a conflict we know is coming, spend the preparation time building our case. We think about what we want to say, we run through the arguments, we prepare our strongest points. And this is not useless. Having clarity about your own position is part of what the prepared ground looks like. But there is something we often do not do, which is try to genuinely read the terrain of the other person. Not what we wish they felt. Not what we think they should feel. What they actually feel based on what we know about them, what has been happening in their life, what this particular issue means to them from their particular vantage. The 5 constant factors that Sun Tzu opens with in Chapter 1, the way, heaven, earth, the commander, and method, include earth, which is terrain, and heaven, which is timing. And these 2 factors together, applied to interpersonal conflict, become a question worth sitting with before any hard conversation. What is the terrain here? Meaning, what is the actual emotional and contextual landscape of this specific person in this specific situation? And what is the timing? Not when is it convenient for me, but when is this person actually in a state where a conversation of this kind can be heard? Heaven in Sun Tzu's framework is literally seasons, weather, night, and day, the time conditions that govern the field. When he says a skilled general accounts for heaven, he means the general understands that attacking at the wrong hour, in the wrong season, into the wrong wind, is a handicap that no amount of skill can fully overcome. The conditions of the moment matter. They are not separate from the strategy. They are part of it. Think about what this means for a hard conversation at home. You have something important you need to discuss with someone you live with. Maybe it is about money, or about how the division of work in the household has been feeling lately, or about something one of you said 3 weeks ago that was never quite addressed. You know, this conversation needs to happen. But when do you bring it up? If you bring it up the moment they walk in the door from a difficult day, you are attacking into the wrong wind. The terrain is not right. They are depleted. They are still carrying whatever they have been carrying for the last 8 hours. And even if what you want to talk about is completely legitimate and reasonable, the timing has loaded the conversation against you before a single word is exchanged. Sun Tzu would say, you have not accounted for heaven. If you bring it up in the middle of another argument in the heat of something already going badly, you are laying siege to a walled city. You are choosing the most expensive, most resistant, least likely to succeed form of engagement available, because the walls of defensiveness are already up, and everything you say will be received through that filter. The skilled move, the move Sun Tzu would recognize as genuine strategy rather than reactive impulse, is to choose the moment as deliberately as you choose your words. Not to wait indefinitely. That is its own kind of avoidance, and it has its own costs, but to read the timing. To wait for a moment of relative ease, of openness, of lowered guard. Not to exploit that openness, but because a person who is not already defended can actually hear what you are saying, and a conversation that is actually heard is the one that can actually go somewhere. Heaven and earth, timing and terrain. 2 of the 5 fundamentals, and both of them in service of the same underlying principle. The conditions of the engagement are not separate from the outcome. They are part of it. Water moves according to the ground. Tactics move according to the foe. A conversation moves according to the moment. Breathe for a moment. Notice the quiet around the edges of your awareness. The particular quality of the dark in this hour. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You are just letting these ideas rest gently near you, the way you might set something down on a nightstand before sleep. There is one more principle in this part of the book that requires a careful pause before we move on. It is from the very opening of Chapter 1, Laying Plans, and it is the line that has made some readers uncomfortable with the whole text, and that has made others dangerously overconfident in how to apply it. The line is this: all warfare is based on deception. Bing zhe guidao ye. In the Chinese, it is 5 characters. Military affairs follow the way of deception. Lionel Giles in 1910 renders it simply, all warfare is based on deception. This line has launched 1,000 bad takes. In the business strategy version of Sun Tzu, it has been used to justify all manner of maneuvering, concealment, and manipulation. In the aggressive, crush your competitors reading of the text, it is often cited with a kind of gleeful satisfaction, as though it grants permission for whatever you are already inclined to do, and applied without care to interpersonal conflict, to the argument with your partner, to the workplace disagreement, to the negotiation with a family member, it becomes genuinely harmful advice. So let us read it carefully, in context, because the context matters enormously. What Sun Tzu is actually describing in this passage is a series of specific tactical feints. He gives examples immediately after the line: when capable, feign incapacity; when active, feign inactivity; when near, make it appear you are far away; when far, make it appear you are near. Offer the enemy bait to lure him, feign disorder, and strike. These are moves in a military engagement against an adversary who is trying to destroy you. They are not prescriptions for how to treat your spouse. The distinction matters, and it is not a fine one. Sun Tzu throughout the text is writing about an adversary in the zero-sum context of war. The enemy, in this framing, is someone whose defeat is the objective. That relationship has fundamentally different stakes, different ethics, and different appropriate tactics than a relationship with someone you love, or someone you have to work alongside every day, or someone whose trust is a resource you depend on and genuinely care about. What the line does offer, reframed for interpersonal context, is something more modest and more genuinely useful. And that is the practice of managing your own presentation, not your honesty, but your composure. In a difficult conversation, especially one that has emotional charge, there is a version of the other person that is looking for signals from you about how dangerous this conversation is going to be. They are reading your body language, your tone, the pace of your words, the set of your face. If you arrive bristling, they arrive bristling. If you arrive with controlled calm, the overall temperature of the exchange begins lower, and a lower starting temperature makes almost every outcome more possible. This is not deception in the sense of concealing your true position or misleading someone about what you want or feel. You can be completely honest about the substance of what you need to discuss, but managing the emotional pitch of how you enter a conversation, arriving with deliberate calm rather than broadcasting every degree of frustration you are carrying, is a form of situational intelligence. It is choosing not to hand the other person your defensiveness as their first piece of information about this conversation. Sun Tzu says water runs away from high places and hastens downward. Composure in this context is what keeps you from flowing directly into the highest resistance terrain the moment you open your mouth. It is not deception. It is not pretending you are not frustrated or worried or hurt. It is the decision that this conversation deserves a chance to work, and that the chance is partly determined by the conditions in which it begins. There is a practice that some people find useful before a hard conversation, a deliberate pause, a breath, a moment of settling before the first word. Not a long pause, not a performance, just enough to move from the reactive state you have been building on the way over to a quieter, more grounded version of yourself. Sun Tzu would recognize this. He would call it preparation. He would say that what you do in the moment before the engagement is part of the engagement. And he would also say, because he is very clear about this throughout the text, that the general who enters the field out of pique has already compromised the campaign. The anger is not your enemy, but it is also not your ally. It is a condition of your inner terrain, and just like heaven and earth, it needs to be accounted for before you move. This is the careful, limited, ethically bounded version of what all warfare is based on deception offers to someone trying to navigate a difficult conversation with another person they actually care about. Not permission to manipulate, not license to conceal. The reminder that how you carry yourself into a conflict is a choice, and that the choice has consequences, and that making it deliberately rather than reactively is itself a form of strategy. The line is not for use on the people you love, but the self-knowledge underneath it, the awareness that you have some control over the conditions you create, that is genuinely useful. That is the part worth carrying with you. Let's rest here for a moment. Take a slow, easy breath. Let the chest soften a little. Let the thoughts that have been moving quiet down. You have been listening for a while now, and the listening itself is enough. You do not need to have organized all of this, or filed it somewhere useful, or already decided what to do with it. The old generals didn't read the text once and immediately know how to use it either. These ideas work slowly, settling into a part of you that recognizes practical truth the way the body recognizes warmth. You may find yourself thinking of something from tonight in a few days, in the middle of a situation you hadn't anticipated, and recognizing it. That is how it tends to arrive. The chapter on fire attacks ends with a man who has spent a lifetime around conflict saying, quietly, that the anger passes. The gladness returns. But the thing you destroyed while angry does not return with the same reliability. And so the entire project of strategy, now all the preparation and terrain reading and patience and waiting for the opening, is in service of that simple, difficult, ancient truth. That what you do in the moment of feeling most certain and most reactive is the moment that most requires your stillness. There is more still ahead. The patience of the prepared position, the particular quality of immovability that Sun Tzu describes, and what it looks like to let someone else's urgency simply not become your urgency, all of that is waiting for us in the next movement of the text. But, for now, just this. The water finds the shape of what is actually in front of it. The conversation begins, when it begins well, in the moment that is actually ready. The anger is weather. It moves through. And the kingdoms you build slowly, carefully, in the spaces between conflicts, those are the ones worth protecting. Rest easy. We will continue in a moment. Take a slow breath here. Notice whatever has begun to loosen in you. And when you are ready, we will continue together. There is a concept in Chapter 1 that most people walk past on their way to the more dramatic material. It sits among the 5 constant factors: the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method, and discipline. And it is easy to let the military framing make it feel abstract, the way a word in a foreign language can feel like it belongs to someone else's experience. But heaven and earth, Tian and Di, are not cosmology in any mystical sense. They are simply timing and terrain. When and where. 2 of the 5 fundamentals of any engagement. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Sun Tzu's entire architecture of preparation rests on the idea that the person who chooses the moment and chooses the ground is already half a victory ahead, not because they are cleverer, not because they have memorized more strategies, but because they walked into something they had already thought about, rather than stumbling into it reactive and unprepared and slightly breathless from whatever else the day had thrown at them. Heaven. The timing. You have probably had the experience of raising something important at entirely the wrong moment. Not the wrong moment in a strategic sense, not something you calculated and got wrong, but the wrong moment in a simpler human sense. Someone had just come home tired, or was in the middle of something, or was carrying something invisible from an earlier part of the day that had nothing to do with you. And the conversation that might have gone reasonably well on a quiet evening, instead went badly. And you are left wondering what happened, how something you had thought about carefully still managed to land so poorly. What happened was heaven. The timing was wrong, not fatally, not permanently, but wrong enough that the conditions were not there. Sun Tzu does not say to wait forever. He does not counsel endless delay as a kind of strategic paralysis. What he says in various ways across the 13 chapters is that you do not choose the moment because it is convenient for you. You choose it because it is actually ready. The ground has to be prepared, the weather has to be right, the person you need to reach has to be reachable, earth, the terrain, and here is where the water comes back in. Chapter 6 says that water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. Not the ground it would prefer, not the ground it imagined on the way there. The actual ground as it is tonight, with this particular person at this particular hour. The mistake most people make in hard conversations is not that they say the wrong thing, it is that they say the right thing to the wrong version of the person. They prepared for a conversation with someone calm and available and ready to hear them, and the person who showed up was distracted or defensive, or still carrying something from 3 days ago that has not been addressed. And so the carefully prepared words land on entirely different terrain than the ones they were shaped for. Reading the terrain is not the same as capitulating to it. You can walk into a room and feel within the first few minutes that the ground is not right, and decide to wait, not retreat, not surrender. Wait The way a general who understands cost waits, knowing that impatience is itself a form of weakness, and that forcing an engagement on poor ground is how you make a winnable situation into a loss. Chapter 2 is blunt about this. There is no instance, it says, of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. The word prolonged is doing something important there. Sun Tzu is not saying that conflict is inherently wrong or that you should never engage. He is saying that drawn-out conflict drains everyone, both sides, regardless of who started it, regardless of who is right. Every day of a prolonged war costs something: resources, morale, the goodwill of the people, the stability of what you are fighting to protect. And the longer it goes, the less of it remains worth protecting when it finally ends. We know this. Most people know this from their own experience. The argument that stretched across weeks, that got picked up and put down and picked up again, that became not about the original thing anymore, but about the pattern of the argument itself, about who said what and who apologized first and who gets to be wronged longest. A drawn-out grudge is self-inflicted attrition. The energy you spend maintaining it, keeping the wound open, rehearsing the injury, calculating the debt, that energy comes from somewhere. It comes from the same place that might otherwise be building something. De-escalation, in this reading, is not the gentle thing. It is not the soft, accommodating, conflict-averse option that people sometimes mean when they say they do not like confrontation. De-escalation, as Sun Tzu would recognize it, is cost control. It is the recognition that the longer this goes on, the more of your own resources it consumes, and the choice, made from strength and not from fear, to stop letting it. That is a different feeling than giving up. It is worth noticing the difference, and now the most sensitive passage in the book, the one that requires the most care. Chapter 1. The line that has been quoted in more business presentations and motivational posters and strategy seminars than almost anything else in the text. All warfare is based on deception. Bingji, Guidao ye? In Lionel Giles's 1910 translation, rendered simply and directly, all warfare is based on deception. In a conversation about interpersonal conflict, about the dinner table argument, the team meeting, the difficult relative, this line needs to be handled with some honesty about what it does and does not mean. Because the naive application of this idea to human relationships is genuinely harmful. If you read it and think, I should deceive the people in my life to get what I want, you have taken a principle designed for the chaos of military engagement and pointed it at your own kitchen, and the only thing that comes of that is the slow erosion of trust, which is the one thing in a relationship of any kind that once destroyed does not easily return. What the line is actually pointing at is something closer to composure, to the management of how you appear under pressure. Sun Tzu is saying that on a battlefield, the side that telegraphs its next move, that reveals its panic or its certainty or its plan through its behavior, gives that information away for free. The skilled commander manages their presence. They do not always show what they know or what they feel or what they intend, because that information is leverage they no longer possess once it's given away. In an everyday disagreement, this maps to something most therapists would also recognize. You are not obligated to perform your reactive emotion in the moment you feel it. The anger that rises in the first seconds of a hard exchange is real. It is yours. But you are not required to discharge it immediately as though the feeling and its expression are the same thing. You can feel it, recognize it, and choose how you move from it. That is not deception. That is composure. It is the management of your own presence in a high-stakes moment, so that your next move is actually yours, chosen, rather than simply what your nervous system defaulted to. This is why the line sits so close in the architecture of Chapter 1 to everything else Sun Tzu says about deliberation and preparation. all warfare is based on deception does not mean lie to your family. It means know your own reactions well enough that you are not simply at their mercy when it matters most. Let us rest here for just a moment. Take a slow, slow breath. Let the weight of the day settle a little further. If any of these ideas is still turning over quietly in you, let it turn. You do not need to resolve it tonight. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. You have seen it, probably, in someone you respect, a person who does not rush to speak when they are challenged, who does not flinch visibly when something unexpected arrives, who seems, in the middle of difficulty, to hold a quality of stillness that is not passivity. It is the opposite of passivity. It is presence without panic, ground without performance. They are not disengaged, they are simply not rattled. And because they are not rattled, everyone in the room adjusts slightly toward them. Sun Tzu gives this quality a name, or rather a set of images, in Chapter 4 of The Art of War. He calls it the prepared position, and he describes it this way: the good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy. To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands. Read that twice if you will, because it is easy to glide past it. First, put yourself beyond the possibility of defeat, then wait, not the other way around. Not fight and then try to defend, not attack and hope the position holds. Secure the ground first. Stabilize what is in your power to stabilize, and then, only then, wait for the moment. He continues in the same chapter. A victorious army wins its victories before seeking battle. A defeated army fights first and afterward looks for victory. That last sentence is almost painful in its honesty. A defeated army fights first and afterward looks for victory, which means it is fighting in the hope that something good will come of the fighting without having done the work that would make victory likely. It is going into the room without knowing what it wants. It is starting the conversation in the middle of its own unresolved feeling at a time it did not choose, in a tone it cannot control, and then, after the damage is done, wishing things had gone differently. This is not a description of a military campaign. This is the anatomy of every argument that got worse than it needed to be. The salary conversation you had after a particularly exhausting week when your patience was already thin and your need was urgent and you said more than you meant. The disagreement with your partner that started in the last 10 minutes before bed when both of you were depleted, when neither of you had chosen the moment, when the window for anything productive had already closed. The confrontation with a colleague that happened in the hallway in front of others when neither of you had time to think and both of you had something to prove. In each of those, the fight happened first and the victory. Some resolution, some repair, some genuine understanding was hoped for afterward, and it rarely came in the shape that was needed because the conditions for it had never been prepared. Sun Tzu would not be surprised by the outcome. He wrote the principle down 25 centuries ago. A defeated army fights first and looks for victory afterward. The prepared position is not a passive thing. That is the part worth sitting with. Patience in this framework is not simply waiting. It is active construction. You are doing something while you wait. You are making yourself difficult to defeat. You are clarifying what you actually want from the conversation. You are thinking through what the other person's position is likely to be and why they hold it. You are choosing the moment and the place with some intention. You are arriving with your own ground already secure so that you are not fighting from panic or from scarcity, but from steadiness. When Chapter 4 says to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, it is saying that the foundation of a good outcome is built before the encounter begins, not during it, before. There is a banner, a physical banner carried into battle, that captures 4 principles drawn from Chapter 7 of The Art of War. The banner reads in Japanese Furinkazan, wind, forest, fire, mountain. It was used by the Japanese warlord Takeda Shingen, who lived from 1521 to 1573, and it takes its images directly from a passage in Chapter 7 called Maneuvering. Sun Tzu writes, "Let your rapidity be that of the wind, in raiding and plundering be like fire, in immovability like a mountain." The full line in Japanese, swift as the wind, silent as the forest, fierce as fire, immovable as the mountain, became the motto of one of the most formidable military forces in 16th century Japan. Takeda Shingen carried it because he understood that a great strategy holds all 4 of those qualities at once. Speed when speed is required, stillness when stillness is required, ferocity when ferocity is required. And then underneath all of it, the mountain. The mountain does not argue. The mountain does not rush to respond. The mountain is simply there, unmoved, and the storm passes around it. This is the image Sun Tzu reaches for when he wants to describe the quality of being unshakable in your position, not rigid, not inflexible. The mountain does not refuse to bend because it is afraid to bend. It does not move because it does not need to, because it is simply that solid in itself. In a hard conversation, there is a version of this available to you, not domination, not stubbornness, something more like the quality of knowing, clearly, quietly, what your position actually is, what you are willing to do, what you are not, what matters enough to hold and what doesn't. When you know those things and have settled them before the conversation begins, you carry a kind of stillness into the room that is not theatrical. It is simply real. It is ground. And ground, in a disagreement, is one of the most powerful things there is, because the person who has no ground is always being pushed into a corner, and the person in a corner stops thinking clearly and starts fighting from fear. The person who has ground does not need to fight that way. They can hold. They can wait. They can let the storm go around the mountain. Take a soft breath here. Let the image of the mountain stay with you for a moment, if it wants to. When you are ready, we will keep going. Now, let us talk about something that may be the most elegant move in the whole of the art of war. It is the strategy of letting your opponent do most of the work. In Chapter 5, Sun Tzu introduces a pair of concepts that sit at the heart of his approach to conflict. He calls them Zheng and Qi. The characters are Zheng and Qi. Zheng is the direct force, the orthodox move, the expected engagement. Qi is the indirect force, the extraordinary move, the unexpected play. And his teaching is this: you engage with the orthodox and you win with the unorthodox. In a military context, this means you use your conventional forces to hold the opponent's attention, to keep them committed to the visible engagement, and then you do something unexpected from a direction they were not watching. The direct force is not the deciding force. The deciding force is the one the opponent did not account for. In Chapter 6, he extends this into something that feels almost like a principle of physics. He writes, "The clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him." He writes, "Appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend. March swiftly to places where you are not expected." The concept underneath both of these is about the direction of energy. In every conflict there is energy moving. The question is whether you are directing it or being directed by it, whether you are choosing where the engagement happens or simply responding to where the other person decided the engagement would be. Most of us, in a heated argument, are simply responding. We are being directed. Someone says something sharp, and we answer the sharpness. Someone attacks a position, and we defend the position. Someone raises their voice, and we raise our voice. We are moving where they are pointing, committing to the engagements they are initiating, being pulled into the places where they feel strongest and we feel least prepared. We are fighting on their ground, at their moment, in the direction they chose. Sun Tzu would look at this pattern and say, "You have allowed the enemy's will to be imposed on you." The inversion of this, the QE move, the indirect, the unexpected, is to stop responding to where the other person is pointing and to redirect the energy somewhere else, to decline the engagement on the ground they chose and to choose the ground yourself. This is not evasion, it is navigation. There is a difference. Evasion is when you refuse to engage at all because engagement is frightening. Navigation is when you recognize that the question being argued is not actually the question that matters, and you redirect to the question that does. When someone is escalating about a specific detail, the tone of that email, the exact wording of that comment, and the real source of friction is something older and larger and more honest, the QE move is to name the real thing gently and redirect the energy there. It changes the terrain. It moves the engagement to a place you chose rather than a place they chose. And very often, it is the first moment in the argument when something true is actually said. Now, the particular application of this that Sun Tzu would recognize most clearly is the strategy of letting an opponent overextend. When someone is angry, truly activated, the kind of angry where they are talking fast and saying more than they mean, they are spending their energy. They are committing forces to an engagement that has not been carefully considered. They are revealing in real time what they know and what they feel and what they fear. They are moving into exposed territory because the emotion is driving them forward faster than their judgment can keep up. And if you hold, if you are the mountain, if you remain in your prepared position, if you do not escalate to meet their escalation, then you do not have to do very much at all. You can simply let them continue until the position they have taken becomes visible to both of you as unsustainable. Most people, if given enough room, will hear themselves. The anger that sounded justified inside begins to sound different out loud in the presence of someone who is not matching it. The argument that felt airtight in the heat of the moment begins to develop cracks when it is given enough air. The person who is overextended often recognizes it themselves, eventually, if they are not being met with an equal and opposite force that justifies continuing. Silence, in this sense, is not weakness. It is the withholding of the fuel that keeps the fire going. Fire without fuel goes out. Chapter 6 contains a line that is almost Zen in its simplicity. Water, Sun Tzu writes, shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing. Water does not fight the rock. Water goes around the rock. And given enough time, the water wins, not because it overwhelmed the rock, but because it simply kept moving in the direction that was available to it, adapting its shape to what was actually there. Adapting to what is actually there. Not to what should be there, not to what was there last time, to the specific, actual texture of this conflict with this person in this moment. Let us rest here very gently for a moment. Slow breath. Let the image of water settle into you if it wants to. There is no rush. We will keep going when you are ready. Now let us talk about something the art of war handles with a kind of sophistication that most modern conflict management books do not even approach. The idea that different conflicts are not the same thing and therefore require genuinely different responses. In chapter 11, the longest chapter in the text, Sun Tzu describes what he calls the 9 situations. He classifies terrain types, where you are geographically and strategically, and for each type of terrain, he specifies a different way of moving. On dispersive ground, do not fight. On light ground, do not stop. On contentious ground, do not attack. On open ground, do not try to block the enemy's way. And on desperate ground, where there is no other option, fight. The details of the military classifications are not what matters for our purposes tonight. What matters is the underlying principle. There is no one-size answer. The move that is correct on this terrain is wrong on that terrain. The response that would be good in one situation would be destructive in another. The text is asking you to read the ground before you respond to it, rather than running the same script in every situation. This is a more sophisticated ask than it sounds. Most of us have a small set of moves that we use in conflict, and we use them repeatedly because they are familiar. We always go quiet, or we always go loud. We always deflect, or we always confront. We always apologize, or we never do. We have a default setting, and when the situation is difficult, the default setting engages because it is what we know. Sun Tzu is saying, the default setting is not a strategy. The default setting is the behavior of someone who has not read the terrain. Someone who fights on dispersive ground when the text says, do not fight there, and who holds still on desperate ground when the text says, that is exactly when you must engage. Reading the terrain of a disagreement means asking some real questions before you move. What kind of conflict is this actually? Is this a conflict about facts? Something that is verifiable, where one position can be shown to be correct? Or is it a conflict about values, torped about what matters, about what is right, where both positions have internal logic and neither one is simply wrong? Or is it a conflict about needs, about what someone requires in order to feel safe or respected or heard, where the facts and the values are almost beside the point? Those are genuinely different terrains, and the move that works on one will fail on the others. A conflict about facts can sometimes be resolved by getting more information, by checking, by being willing to be corrected. That is dispersive ground, light, easily scattered, not worth a heavy engagement. A conflict about values is almost never resolved by more information because the disagreement is not about what is true, but about what matters. On that ground, the most useful move is often not to win, but to understand, to become clear about what you actually share, and honest about where you actually diverge, and to decide what that means for the relationship rather than trying to convert anyone. A conflict about needs is the terrain where listening does more than arguing, where the question, what would make this better for you, does more than any position you could defend, where the other person may not even know how to name what they need, and the most powerful move available is to slow down enough that they have room to find it. Sun Tzu does not use any of those categories, obviously, but the architecture of his thinking is exactly this. Know the terrain before you engage, because the terrain determines the correct move, and there is no correct move that works everywhere. On desperate ground, fight. But make sure you are actually on desperate ground before you commit everything to the battle. Take a breath here. Let this thought settle, gently, wherever it wants to land. We are nearly at the end of the teaching, but there is one more thing. Actually, there are a few more things, and they are satisfying in a different way, because now we can put down the principles and do something the listener who came to this video maybe suspected was coming and has been quietly waiting for. We can talk about what Sun Tzu did not write. Because if you have spent any time near the art of war, not necessarily reading it, just existing in the culture that quotes it, you have almost certainly encountered a few lines attributed to Sun Tzu that are not in the text, not paraphrased, not condensed, simply not there. The first one is the most famous. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You have heard this. You may have quoted it. It is excellent advice, genuinely. It is pithy and memorable and the kind of thing that sounds ancient and wise in the way that ancient and wise things sound. Sun Tzu did not write it. The line is most famously delivered in The Godfather Part 2. Michael Corleone says it. It is sometimes loosely attributed to Machiavelli in certain discussions, but even that link is loose. It is not in The Art of War. If you search the 13 chapters, the laying of plans, the waging of war, the attack by stratagem, all the way through to the use of spies, you will not find it. The Giles translation, the standard English text, since 1910, does not contain it. What Sun Tzu does say, in chapter 11, is that you should know the enemy's situation. Gather intelligence, understand the terrain, use your spies wisely. But the specific line about keeping enemies closer has no home in the original text. This matters not to diminish the advice, but because the actual source is more useful to know. When you attribute wisdom correctly, you understand its context. Michael Corleone's reasoning and Sun Tzu's reasoning are not the same. One is about control within organized crime. The other is about intelligence and strategy in open conflict. Knowing which is which helps you apply the right idea to the right situation. The second false attribution is perhaps more dramatic. You have probably seen it floating in some font over an image of mountains or bamboo. If you wait by the river long enough, the bodies of your enemies will float by. This is not in the art of war, not in any version, not in Giles, not in Griffith, not in any of the major translations or editions. Scholars who have looked for it have not found it. It has circulated widely on the internet and on motivational posters, and in certain business culture spaces, attributed to Sun Tzu with great confidence, and it simply does not come from him. Which is interesting because the advice it contains is almost exactly what Sun Tzu does teach: the patient position, the waiting for the opponent to overextend, the idea that time is on the side of the one who is prepared and not on the side of the one who is agitated. But Sun Tzu never expressed it that way. The actual text is more careful, more specific, and more honest about what patience requires. And the third one is subtler. It involves the most famous single line associated with the art of war, the one that appears everywhere, the one you may have seen on motivational accounts and management seminars. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is a paraphrase. The real line, the one actually in chapter 3 in the Giles 1910 translation, reads, "To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." The meaning is the same, but the phrasing matters for a reason that is easy to miss. The paraphrase says the supreme art of war, the real line says the acme of skill. The acme of skill is a specific thing, a peak of individual mastery, something earned by a person through discipline and preparation. The supreme art of war sounds like a category, a universal principle, something abstract and ambient. The acme of skill is personal. It is yours to develop or not. The real line is actually more demanding and more honest. It is not saying that avoiding the fight is simply the best strategy in some general sense. It is saying that the capacity to subdue the enemy without fighting, to diffuse, to navigate, to hold, to let the opponent overextend, to win before a word has been raised in anger. That capacity is the highest form of mastery available. It is something a person becomes, not just something a person decides to try. Sun Tzu is pointing at a kind of skill and calling it the top of the mountain. Let us take one more soft breath together. The night is deep, and we are nearly at the gathering place where all of this begins to come together. There is one more thread to follow before we close. It is the thread that connects a 2,500-year-old text, written in roughly 6,000 Chinese characters, to the world where you are lying right now, in the dark, in this particular year, with this particular set of things you are carrying. How did it travel? The art of war spent many centuries circulating in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, where it was read and studied and debated as a genuine military text, as well as a philosophical one. It shaped the thinking of military and political leaders across that region for more than a millennium before a French Jesuit priest named Father Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot produced the first European translation in 1772. 1772. The American Revolution had not yet begun. Napoleon would not come to power for another 3 decades. And yet Amiot, working from Chinese texts, carried the ideas of a man from the spring and autumn period, a man who may or may not have had the personal name Sun Wu, whose biography was recorded 4 centuries after his supposed life by Sima Qian in the records of the Grand Historian, carried those ideas across the centuries and across an ocean into French. The first reliable English translation came from Lionel Giles in 1910. Giles was a scholar at the British Museum, and his translation is the public domain text that most English quotations still draw from, which is why, when you read a line attributed to Sun Tzu in a business book or a self-help article or an internet graphic, the phrasing often has that particular 19th century quality to it: careful, slightly formal, clear. Then in 1963, Samuel B. Griffith produced a new translation that brought the text into modern military and business culture. Griffith was a brigadier general in the United States Marine Corps, and he understood both the military and the strategic dimensions of the text in a way that combined scholarly rigor with practical application. His 1963 edition came with a foreword by B.H. Liddell Hart, one of the most influential military theorists of the 20th century. What Liddell Hart wrote in that foreword is remarkable. He argued that if the leaders of the Western powers in the early 20th century had absorbed Sun Tzu, had genuinely internalized his anti-attrition philosophy, his insistence that prolonged conflict benefits no one, his preference for indirect over direct force, the catastrophic bloodletting of the First World War's trench campaigns might have been avoided. The trenches of the Western Front, where millions of men were sent against fortified positions in direct, frontal assaults that gained almost no ground at enormous cost, were, in Liddell Hart's reading, the exact opposite of everything Sun Tzu taught. Chapter 2 says plainly, there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. The trench war was the supreme historical example of ignoring that principle on an industrial scale. Liddell Hart was not being rhetorical. He was making a strategic argument that a different way of thinking about conflict, the way that privileges indirect approach, that values the prepared position over the frontal assault, that insists the longest route is sometimes the fastest, might have changed the shape of the 20th century. That is the weight of what is in the small book, the book that fits in a pamphlet that can be read in an hour. After Griffith's translation, the text entered business culture through the 1980s and 1990s, when it appeared on management reading lists and in corporate strategy sessions, and in the language of executives who were, in a way that was sometimes illuminating and sometimes absurd, mapping ancient military principles onto competitive markets. It appeared in the film Wall Street, where the aggressive, zero-sum logic of financial competition made Sun Tzu seem like a natural companion. The Wall Street's reading of the text leaned heavily toward the dominate your competitors interpretation that is almost exactly what the real text argues against. And then there was Tony Soprano in the 3rd season of The Sopranos, reading The Art of War on the recommendation of his therapist Dr. Melfi. This is one of the most self-aware moments in a television series famous for its self-awareness. A man who literally runs an organized crime family, who makes his living through violence and intimidation, picking up a text whose highest principle is that fighting is what you do when you have already failed strategically. The joke is not at Tony's expense exactly. It is more like the text looking at Tony's life and seeing very clearly someone who fights first and hopes for victory afterward. Someone who has never, not once, put himself beyond the possibility of defeat before seeking battle. Someone whose whole existence is the refutation of the acme of skill. Dr. Melfi gave him the right book. He read it. And it did not change him, because the prepared position is not a book you read. It is a practice you develop over time, in the small moments, in the conversations that happen before anything is at stake, so that when something is at stake, the habit is already there. The USMC places The Art of War on its recommended reading list, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living text, because the principles in it are not military in the narrow sense. They are principles about how to think under pressure, how to read a situation before you commit to a response, how to hold ground without losing yourself, how to use the energy available to you with intention rather than just burning it. These are things that a Marine needs. They are also things you need. In the morning, in the conversation you have been dreading, in the room with the person you love, at the moment when something old and heavy comes up again, and you can feel the familiar pull toward the old pattern, the loud one or the silent one, or whichever version of fighting first and hoping for victory you have been practicing your whole life. And now, we have traveled a long way together tonight. We began at the paradox that the most famous war strategy text in history is at its core an argument for restraint, that the single highest principle in all 13 chapters, from the laying of plans through the 9 situations to the use of spies, is the acme of skill. Subdue the enemy without fighting. That a text written in roughly 6,000 characters, which can be read in an hour, contains the spine of something that shaped 25 centuries of strategy and traveled by bamboo, then by manuscript, then by Jesuit translation, then by scholarly English rendering, then by management seminar and television screen, all the way to tonight. We met the 4-tier hierarchy of attack, the hierarchy that puts besieging a walled city at the very bottom as the worst policy of all, the option of last resort. And we saw how it maps to a de-escalation ladder for a work disagreement. Block the bad plan first, prevent it from gaining allies, engage directly only when you must, and treat the frontal confrontation as the outcome you are trying to avoid, not the demonstration of strength you are working toward. We sat with the full 3-part version of the most quoted passage in the book, not just know the enemy and know yourself, but the devastating completion. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither, you will succumb in every battle. And the surprising weight of the self-knowledge half, because the person you bring into every conflict, your defaults, your fears, your unresolved patterns, is the factor most in your control, and also the one most often left unexamined. We visited the principle that a victorious army wins first and fights afterward, that the fight you are in has already been shaped by the preparation you did or did not do before it began, that the salary conversation held from a position of clarity and groundedness is a different event from the salary conversation held from desperation and urgency, even if the words are almost the same. We walked through the passage from chapter 12 that may be the most emotionally intelligent sentence in the entire text. Anger may in time change to gladness. Vexation may be succeeded by content. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never again come into being. The warning that emotion, however real, is not a sufficient reason to destroy something, that the feeling will pass, and what you did while inside the feeling may not be undoable. We traced the water principle, adapting to the terrain of the actual conflict you are in, rather than the conflict you expected, or the one that happened last time. We let the 5 constant factors in the way, heaven, earth, the commander, method, become a way of thinking about the conditions that shape any disagreement before it even begins. The alignment between people, the timing, the place, the quality of the person in the center of it, the discipline of how it is conducted. We held the image of the mountain, immovable, from the Furinkazan banner drawn from chapter 7, carried by Takeda Shingen, into battle in 16th century Japan. The quality of being settled in yourself before the storm arrives, so the storm has nothing to push against. We explored Zheng and Qi, the orthodox and the extraordinary force, and what it means to stop being directed by someone else's escalation and to redirect the energy to the ground you chose, to let an opponent overextend by not providing the fuel that keeps their fire burning, to be water that finds the available direction rather than stone that insists on crashing into whatever is in front of it. We matched the move to the terrain, 9 situations, 9 different responses, the insistence that there is no default setting that works everywhere, and that reading the actual nature of this conflict is the prerequisite to responding well to it. And we cleared the false attributions, the line about keeping your enemies closer that came from Michael Corleone, not from Sun Wu. The bodies floating by the river that no scholar has ever found in any edition of the text. The supreme art of war that is actually the acme of skill, and the difference between those two phrasings and why the real version is more demanding and more honest and more useful. The contrarian thesis, the one that the video has been building toward from the beginning, lands here. Everyone who has picked up the art of war in a business context, every management guru who has quoted it in a seminar, every motivational graphic that has paired a Sun Tzu line with an image of a warrior in shadow. They have mostly been reading it as a manual for winning aggressively, for dominating the competition, for crushing the opposition, for being the most ruthless, most strategically devastating force in the room. And this is almost precisely the opposite of what the text teaches. Sun Tzu's text opens with a chapter on deliberation, not aggression. It places the avoidance of conflict at the top of its hierarchy of skill. It warns explicitly against fighting out of emotion. It insists that prolonged conflict benefits no one. It praises the commander who wins before any battle has been fought, and it holds in a kind of quiet contempt the commander who fights first and then hopes for victory, the one who relies on brute force because preparation and intelligence were not done. The person who has to fight, in Sun Tzu's framework, has already half lost, because the fight means the superior moves failed. It means the planning was insufficient, or the positioning was wrong, or the moment was chosen badly, or the opponent was not understood well enough to be managed before things escalated. The fight is the fallback. The acme of skill is what happens when the fight never becomes necessary. Applied to your life, to the argument with the coworker, the conversation with the partner, the family dinner where the same thing always comes up. This reframe is not merely philosophical, it is practical. It suggests that the measure of how well you handle conflict is not how well you argue when you are in the middle of one. It is how rarely you are in the middle of one. How often you have prepared the position well enough that the escalation never comes. How often you have chosen the moment wisely enough that the conversation goes differently. How often you have held still long enough that the other person found their own way to something more honest without you having to push them there. This is not softness. There is nothing soft about the mountain. It is the long discipline of someone who has chosen to be difficult to defeat before they choose to fight, who has decided that the argument they never have to have is the one they won most cleanly, who has understood in the bone-deep way that practice eventually produces that the person in the room who is least reactive has the most power, not because they are suppressing themselves, but because they have done the preparation, know yourself, secure the ground, read the terrain, choose the moment, that makes the prepared position not a pose, but a reality. Sun Tzu, in all of his practicality, would probably be impatient with the idea that this is wisdom reserved for generals and strategists and warlords. He wrote a text that is, at its heart, about how a thinking person navigates conflict with minimal damage and maximum intelligence. The fact that it was written for armies does not narrow its application, it expands it. Because conflict, or the human experience of being in opposition with another person, of needing something they are not giving, of holding a position someone else is challenging, is not a military invention. It is one of the oldest things there is. And the people who have handled it most gracefully across all the centuries and all the contexts where it has appeared have tended to be people who embody what Sun Tzu describes: not aggressive, not passive, but prepared, grounded, patient in the active sense, where patience is the work you do before the moment arrives, able to read the terrain of this particular conflict rather than running a script, able to let the opponent overextend without becoming the fuel for their fire, able to hold the mountain quality, unmoved, present, not performed, until the storm goes past. The text is 6,000 characters. You could read it tomorrow, in an hour, in the Giles translation, which has been in the public domain since 1910. And you would find underneath all the military language something that is not a manual for aggression at all. You would find a deeply anti-war text written by someone who had thought harder than almost anyone about what conflict costs, in time, in resources, in relationships, in the fabric of what has been built, and who arrived at the conclusion that the person who can win without fighting has reached the highest place available. That is the acme of skill. Not the supreme art of war, the acme of skill. A personal thing, a practice, something you work toward. The battle, Sun Tzu tells us, is won or lost before the first word is spoken. The kingdom that is destroyed cannot come back. The anger that drove the fight may pass, but what was said in the anger may remain. And the commander who wins first and then engages, who arrives with the ground already secured, who knows themselves as well as they know the person across from them, who has chosen the moment and the terrain and is present without panic, that commander has already half won before anyone has said a single word. Tonight, if there is a hard conversation somewhere ahead of you, let it wait in the place where the prepared position lives, not the place of dread where you rehearse the worst version of it over and over, the place of quiet preparation. What do I actually want from this? What does the other person actually need? What is the right moment and the right ground? What am I carrying into it that is mine, not theirs? Those are not military questions, they are simply human ones. And they have been asked, in one form or another, for as long as people have been in disagreement with each other, which is as long as there have been people. The bamboo slips from Yinkashan carried the words through 2,000 years. Amiot carried them across an ocean. Giles put them into English that still rings with precision. Griffith and Liddell Hart handed them to the modern world. And Tony Soprano's therapist, in a moment of gentle irony, handed them to a man who had spent his whole life fighting first and hoping for victory, and who, despite everything, could not quite put them down. You have listened to them tonight in the dark. In whatever room this is, in whatever time it is where you are, carrying whatever it is you are carrying. You do not need to remember any of it. If one image stayed with you, the mountain, or the water, or the army that wins before the battle, let that be enough. Let it work in you while you sleep, in whatever quiet way ideas work when we are not watching them. The principle holds whether you are awake or not. Take one last slow breath. Let the weight settle. Let the night do its work. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.